I saw my first patient in 1982 without knowing that he was an HIV patient, because at that time HIV was not yet discovered. So it was a kind of strange situation. A young dentist, Argentinian, living in Miami, came back to Argentina because he felt very sick. He wanted to be with his family. He was confined at the hospital with a strange type of pneumonia. And what was a little bit surprising, that he disclosed very openly, be reminded in 1982 Argentina, that he was gay. And he had herpes and other infections, and eventually he passed away very soon. So at that time we didn't understand what was happening, but when the second patient came, and this was a dancer of our national ballet, eventually also men having sex with men, and he had a cryptococcal meningitis. Then I said to one of my few co-workers at that time, look, something wrong is happening here. It could not be by chance that two gay people have this type of infections. Be reminded, for the audience, that internet that didn't exist at that time. You couldn't Google. So a colleague of us came back from the US, from the American Society of Clinical Oncology meeting, and he just by chance heard the conversation and said, look, are you talking about the disease that is hitting gay people? Because they presented several cases of Kaposi sarcoma, and seems to be a disease that affects these people. So this was for me the confirmation. I started to look at the references. You had to wait until by plane the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA and all the journals came, and I said, okay, it must be a new disease. So probably we could try to gather 5 or 6 cases, and you know, all of us, we went to see our name in a journal and publish. I never imagined that at the end of the day we would be sitting here talking about a completely new disease, and 25 years after the IAS creation. No? I learned about the IAS in almost when the IAS was born, because in 1988 I went to my second International AIDS conference. The first one I went was in Washington, D.C. in 1987, 3,500 people, or 2,500 people, I think. And I still can recall my surprise, because it was my first International AIDS conference, and when George Bush, father, went there as a vice president, and he gave a speech, and the community stood up and started booing him. I said, my God, they're booing the vice president. It was completely unbelievable for me. And so I started to realize the power of the AIDS community. And next year in Stockholm, 1988, the society was officially created. And I was following the conferences. I went to all the International AIDS conferences since 1987 up to now here in Kuala Lumpur, 2013. So it's 26 years in a row that I've been part of these conferences. I always thought that, I mean, you can be a good doctor, taking care of your patients, trying to be nice to them, and to apply the knowledge that has been generated by others. Or you could also contribute to generate new knowledge. This is why I am also involved in research. The same applies for the struggle against AIDS. You can be part of the movement, just following the movement, or you could give some leverage to the movement. And this is the way I feel it. The key issues that affected that era, I think that one certainly was the issue of access to antiretroviral therapy. Be reminded that IAS made a big difference in 2000 by pushing access to antiretroviral therapy in developing countries, particularly in Africa, during the Durban conference. I still can recall the discussions with people saying it's impossible to provide antiretroviral therapy in those settings because, you know, people will not take the medicines and there's no monitoring and there's no lab in place and no enough doctors and no. And one of our former presidents, Job Lange, when he was challenged by people saying, you know, you are providing drugs that are toxic and you cannot monitor, so people might eventually become sick and die. He said, I am ready to pay a 2% mortality rate against 100% mortality rate due to HIV. And he was right. So that was one of the big issues. The other one was certainly the issue of stigma and discrimination and lack of political will from the powerful and wealthy and rich countries to help the developing countries that couldn't afford the extraordinary impact of the epidemic and the cost. And I would also say that there was a time in which the community was very eagerly fighting pharmaceutical companies due to the issue of pricing, etc., etc. At the same time, generics came across another component that also ignited a very severe debate about the quality of the generics. And I think that now, if you look back, we are in a much mature situation, you know. Now we have the patent pool, we have companies making agreements with generic companies. Companies understood that they can make money in wealthy countries, at least as of now. I don't know if it will continue with the fiscal environment, but they can make the revenues in Europe, in US, Canada, etc. And they understood that they only can have a very small profit in developing countries. So I think there's still a lot to do, but I think we are in our way. And that's the reason why from when we think about the year 2000, we have only 200,000 people on antiretroviral therapy in developing countries. And the latest notice I had during this conference is that almost 10 million people are now on treatment. We have made a very extraordinary jump, I would say, from a very low number to where we are now, and we still are behind our needs. But we have made a difference for 10 million people, which is very important. No? When I was president, I had the opportunity to chair the 2008 Internationalist Conference in Mexico City, which was a huge conference. First one in Latin America. We had the first HIV pathogenesis and treatment conference in 2001 in Buenos Aires, but it was the first one was a kind of small, 3,500 people. But the international, the big one, with the strong community participation, was held in Mexico in 2008. And we had several different activities there. One of them was the meeting of the Ministers of Education and Public Health representatives, in which we got a document which I think for our region, as you know, very influenced by the Catholic Church and very macho-oriented culture, etc., was extremely important. Acknowledging the importance of sexual education, of the respect to sexual diversity, the need of using the educational system in order to promote integration, avoid discrimination and stigma, etc., etc., etc. And still today, this document is the basis for many community groups in some countries in which still there is a lot to do in terms of human rights, but the region is certainly transforming itself. I can be proud that Argentina was the first country to approve gay marriage in the region, and even more than that, we have now a law that you can change your document if you're a transgender person. So it's kind of friendly in terms of human rights, which has to do with the track record of my country after having suffered a terrible military dictatorship, and they are still putting in jail some of those criminals. So I think that in the context of human rights, that meeting was extremely important. We will not overcome the epidemic if we are not able to create an environment that understands that our enemy is the virus and not the people that carry the virus. Some people ask me about what would be what has been the impact of HIV on scientific research. I would say that there's no any other disease in the history of medicine in which such amount of knowledge has been gathered in such a short time span. Think about it. First cases, 1981, in the west coast of the US. 2 years later, the virus was discovered. 6 years later, the first drug was there. And even 4 years after the first cases were discovered, the ELISA test was available. And in about 15 years' time, we have the treatment for that. We don't have the cure yet, but we were able to get the treatment. The leverage that HIV research gave to issues like virology and immunology, our understanding about the role of inflammation, which is also now serving other fields like cardiology, metabolic syndrome, etc., is unbelievable. And the lessons we learned in HIV are now being applied to another unmet medical need, which is hepatitis. And you know, half of the way in the fight against hepatitis C in particular has been in some way paved by the HIV knowledge. So I think it has been an enormous amount of contribution.